One night, a prisoner of war camp built for 3,000 men woke up holding more than 12,000. By morning, the food was gone. The water lines were empty. The medical tents were already full. And yet the camp did not collapse. No riot. No mass escape. No recorded disaster. Because overnight, the prisoners themselves did something the official reports barely mentioned. And no one spoke about how close everything came to breaking. Spring 1945, Western Europe. The front lines were moving faster than expected. Entire German units were surrendering at once, columns stretching for miles along the roads. Allied collection points turned into temporary camps. Temporary camps became permanent ones overnight. One of these camps sat in an open field, surrounded by wire and wooden towers. It had been designed for a manageable number of prisoners, organized barracks, ration schedules, medical areas, sanitation trenches. Then the transports began arriving without warning. Truck after truck. Columns of exhausted soldiers marching through the gates. Men who hadn't eaten properly in days. By sunset, the camp population had doubled. By midnight, it had quadrupled. The guards did something unexpected. They stopped giving detailed orders. Instead, they told the prisoners to organize themselves. At the time, it sounded practical. Later, it would raise uncomfortable questions. Because something inside the camp changed that night. Something the records never fully explained. The first sign came from the food line. When breakfast distribution began, there wasn't enough for everyone. The guards expected chaos, pushing, shouting, men breaking formation. But the prisoners did something else. They stepped back. Quietly, groups began counting their own numbers. Older prisoners, those who had arrived weeks earlier, separated the newest arrivals into smaller units. Then something strange happened. Some groups refused their full ration. They handed part of it to the men who had just arrived. No orders. No announcement. No explanation. The guards wrote in their report. Distribution remained orderly. But witnesses later described something different. Men were watching each other carefully, measuring behavior, as if they already knew what could happen if the order failed. And by the end of the first day, one question was spreading through the camp. Who was actually in charge now? Through the afternoon, the arrivals didn't stop. The open spaces between barracks disappeared first, then the pathways, then the areas that had once been reserved for medical triage. New prisoners slept wherever they could, under trucks, beside fences, between rows of men already lying shoulder to shoulder. No one complained loudly. That was the first unspoken rule. Noise drew attention. Attention brought uncertainty. Inside the overcrowded compounds, small groups began forming naturally, men from the same unit, the same region, sometimes just those who had arrived together. They shared blankets. They shared rumors. And they avoided certain questions. How long will we be here? When does transport begin? Who decides the rations? Because no one really knew. As evening approached, another pattern appeared. Men who had arrived earlier began walking the camp slowly, observing. Not guards. Prisoners. They stopped fights before they started. They redirected lines. They told newcomers where to sleep. No authority badges, no written orders. Just quiet instructions. And most men obeyed. Because something in the air felt fragile. As if one mistake could break everything. On the third day, the routine changed. The morning roll call was shorter. Not because fewer men were present. Because several groups did not report. At first, the guards assumed confusion. The camp was overcrowded. Units were mixed together. But by afternoon, word spread. Some prisoners had been moved overnight. Not transferred. Relocated. Behind one row of barracks, a new section had appeared marked by rope instead of wire. Inside were the weakest men, the injured, the sick, those who hadn't eaten in days. No official order had created it. The prisoners had done it themselves. Then another detail surfaced. The men assigned to care for that section were not volunteers. They had been selected. Doctors, medics, former orderlies. Chosen quietly by other prisoners. And one more thing. Those assigned to the medical area stopped appearing in regular food lines. They were being fed separately. From somewhere. The guards had not arranged it, which meant the prisoners were now controlling their own ration system. And no one knew how far that control went. Long after the camp stabilized, one small discovery revealed what had really happened. It began in a supply hut that most guards rarely entered. The building had originally been used for spare tools and damaged equipment, but during the overcrowding crisis, prisoners had been seen moving in and out of it at night. At the time, no one asked why. Weeks later, when a guard finally opened the door during an inspection, he noticed something unusual. The floor had been swept clean. Blankets were stacked along the walls. Empty ration tins had been washed and reused as water containers. But the most important detail was hidden in a wooden crate. Inside was a notebook. No official markings. No camp stamp. Just handwritten pages. At first glance, it looked like a simple list of names. But the longer he looked, the more unsettling it became. Each page was organized into columns. Name, unit, condition, strength level, and then one final column. Ration status. Some entries were marked full. Others read half. A few had a single word written beside them. Priority. No one spoke about it openly. Because this wasn't just record keeping. This was a system. The notebook revealed something the official reports never mentioned. During the worst overcrowding days, the prisoners had quietly formed a medical and survival committee. Not elected. Not announced. Identified. Doctors found other doctors. Medics located orderlies. Men who had worked in logistics before the war began organizing supplies without being told. Every night they walked through the camp. Not looking for trouble. Looking for weakness. Men who couldn't stand at roll call. Men who stopped speaking. Men who had stopped trying to eat. Those names went into the notebook. And then the difficult decisions began. One former prisoner later described the moment the system changed. The food deliveries had not increased, but the population kept growing. If rations were distributed equally, the weakest would die first. And once deaths began, panic would follow. So the committee did something no one wanted to admit. They adjusted the food. Quietly. Stronger prisoners were encouraged, sometimes pressured, to accept reduced portions. New arrival received emergency shares for the first 2 days. And the weakest men were fed first, before the main lines even opened. There were no announcements. Just quiet instructions passed through group leaders. And most men obeyed. Because everyone could see what was happening. Bodies were getting thinner. Faces were changing. Movement was slowing. Something had to be done. But the notebook revealed an even darker detail. Some names were crossed out. Not because those men had died. Because they had been moved. During the 3rd week, the committee identified a group of prisoners who were too weak to survive in the open compounds. Instead of leaving them where they were, they relocated them at night. Back to that supply building. Witnesses later remembered the scene. Lantern light inside the dark structure. Buckets of water carried quietly across the yard. Blankets taken from multiple barracks and stacked together. No official permission. No guard supervision. Just prisoners creating a recovery ward from whatever they could find. And for several days, the weakest men disappeared from public view. At roll call, their names were still counted. But they weren't standing in line. The effect was immediate. Fewer collapses during formation. Fewer medical emergencies in the open yard. Less visible suffering. From the outside, the camp looked more stable. The guards noticed the improvement. But they didn't interfere. Because stability was the only thing keeping the situation under control. And asking too many questions might have forced them to take responsibility for a system they couldn't manage themselves. One page of the notebook contained a sentence written across the bottom. The handwriting was different from the rest. Shaky slower. It read, "If they cannot stand, they cannot survive the next week." Below that line were 6 names. 5 of those men later recovered. One did not. But the record showed something else. After the recovery ward was created, the number of deaths in the camp did not rise, even though the population kept increasing. That was the moment the hidden system proved it was working. There was one final detail that made the discovery even more unsettling. The notebook wasn't written by one person. Different handwriting appeared throughout. Different ink. Different styles. This wasn't a leader's plan. It was a shared agreement. A quiet understanding spreading across the camp. And no one had ordered it. When the guard finished examining the notebook, he closed it and put it back into the crate. He did not file a report. Because by then, the overcrowding crisis was easing. New transports had slowed. Supply deliveries had improved. And the camp was functioning. Officially, the stability came from improved logistics. Unofficially, it came from decisions made in the dark. Decisions about who needed more, who could manage with less, and who might not survive without immediate help. Years later, former prisoners would describe that period the same way. No one talked about the system, because once the emergency ended, the notebook disappeared. The recovery ward was dismantled. The blankets were returned. The ration adjustments stopped. But for several critical weeks, control inside the camp had not come from the guards. It had come from prisoners making calculations no one ever wanted to write down. And that was the part history almost forgot. Because the camp never collapsed. But it survived for a reason few people were willing to admit. By the time summer arrived, the crisis inside the camp appeared to be over. New prisoner transports had slowed. Supply deliveries became more regular. The overcrowded compounds began to thin as transfers moved men elsewhere. From the outside, the camp finally looked normal. But inside the administrative offices, something quieter was happening. And no one spoke about it. The first change appeared in the paperwork. Daily population reports were rewritten using rounded numbers. Instead of exact figures, entries now read approximately 9,000. Estimated capacity reached. Conditions stable. Earlier documents showing the sudden population surge were no longer attached to the main files. They hadn't been destroyed. They were simply no longer included. One clerk later remembered being told, "Use the latest totals. The earlier numbers are no longer relevant." But those earlier numbers were the ones that showed how close the camp had come to failing. And removing them made the crisis look smaller than it had been. A second change followed. New operating instructions arrived from higher command. From that point forward, Each compound was required to have official prisoner representatives. Their names had to be recorded, their responsibilities defined, their authority limited to specific tasks. Food distribution, roll call organization, sanitation oversight. Everything had to be documented. Because during the overcrowding weeks, the prisoners had organized themselves without permission. And that kind of unofficial control made administrators uneasy. One officer later wrote privately, "We must know who is giving the orders." But the unofficial leaders from the crisis period were never formally identified. No one stepped forward. No list existed. And the system that had actually kept the camp functioning remained invisible. Then came the missing file. During a routine archive review, a staff member searched for internal notes about prisoner ration adjustments. He had heard rumors, different food levels, separate feeding times, medical priority lists. But when he checked the records, there was nothing. Standard ration tables were present. Distribution schedules were intact. But there was no mention of any internal reallocation. No temporary policy. No emergency authorization. And no reference to the notebook that had been discovered in the supply building. When he asked about it, the response was brief. There were no unofficial ration systems. The conversation ended there. Procedures inside the camp changed again after that. Food distribution was moved closer to guard supervision. Medical intake forms became more detailed. Any prisoner assigned to assist medical staff had to be registered and approved. Spontaneous organization was no longer allowed. Everything required authorization. Because the administration had learned something uncomfortable. Order had been maintained during the worst period, not because of control, but because control had been shared. And that raised a difficult question. If prisoners could manage themselves effectively in crisis, what did that say about the system meant to manage them? One more adjustment followed quietly. New arrivals were now processed in smaller groups. Instead of allowing large numbers to enter the compounds at once, holding areas were used to slow the flow. The official explanation was simple: improved intake efficiency. But internally, the concern was different. If the population surged again too quickly, the camp might once again rely on unofficial structures to survive. And this time, those structures might not stay invisible. Weeks later, a medical officer noticed something else. The recovery building, the one used during the crisis, had been cleared. The blankets were gone. The water containers removed. The floor returned to its original storage layout. There was no sign it had ever been used as a ward. When he asked who had authorized the cleanup, no one could give a clear answer. Because officially, the recovery ward had never existed. Around the same time, behavior inside the camp began to change. Prisoners who had once made quiet decisions now avoided involvement. When problems appeared, they waited for instructions. When shortages occurred, they reported them instead of redistributing resources themselves. The initiative that had once held the camp together slowly disappeared. Not because it wasn't needed, because it was no longer safe to act without permission. One former prisoner later described the shift. "Before we solved problems first, after we waited." A final administrative note appeared at the end of the summer. It was brief, almost routine. Camp conditions remained orderly throughout the period of increased capacity. No mention of emergency measures. No reference to internal organization. No acknowledgement of the weeks when official control had been nearly impossible. The crisis had been reduced to a single sentence. And that sentence suggested nothing unusual had happened. But those who had been there remembered something different. They remembered the nights when food was counted by hand, the quiet decisions about who needed more, the lists that no one admitted writing, the building that existed only in memory. And they noticed something else. After the new procedures were introduced, the camp became more controlled, but it also became slower to respond, more orderly, less adaptive, because the system now trusted documentation more than judgment. And the one thing it no longer allowed was the kind of quiet cooperation that had once prevented collapse. Years later, when historians reviewed the official archives, the overcrowding period looked manageable. Population fluctuations, temporary strain, no major incidents. The records showed stability. But the records did not show the decisions made in darkness. They did not show the notebook. They did not show the recovery ward. And they did not show how close the system had come to losing control before prisoners quietly took responsibility themselves. Because some forms of order leave no paper behind. And sometimes, the most important system is the one that never officially existed. Long after the camp returned to normal numbers, something small continued to happen at meal time. It wasn't written in any procedure. No guard ordered it. No announcement explained it. But those who had been there during the overcrowding weeks noticed the change immediately. When food was distributed, some prisoners no longer ate right away. They paused. They looked around first, quietly, carefully, as if checking something no one else could see. The behavior started with the men who had worked in the medical section during the crisis. When their portions were handed out, they didn't sit down immediately like the others. Instead, they scanned the line, watching for someone who looked weaker, someone who hadn't stood straight at roll call, someone who was holding their tin with shaking hands. Sometimes nothing happened, but sometimes a small exchange followed. A piece of bread moved from one portion to another. A ladle of soup tipped slightly into a second bowl. A quick gesture, no conversation. No one acknowledged it, because everyone understood what it meant. By then, the emergency system was gone. The notebook had disappeared. The recovery building had been cleared. The official ration schedule was equal again. But the memory of the crisis had changed something. During those weeks, survival had depended on difficult choices. Not equal choices, necessary ones. And once men had seen how quickly strength could disappear, the idea of fixed portions no longer felt absolute. One former prisoner later described it simply. You learn to look at people, not numbers. Another habit appeared at night. When new arrivals entered the compound, the older prisoners didn't wait for instructions. They counted, quietly, group by group, not because they were organizing officially, because they wanted to know one thing: how many more mouths had just arrived. If the number was too high, conversations began immediately. Who had extra blankets? Who could share space? Which men looked exhausted enough to need help? No lists, no leaders, just the same quiet calculation that had once kept the camp from breaking. And again, no one talked about it openly, because the official system now discouraged independent action. But the instinct remained. Years later, some of the men who survived were asked what they remembered most about that period. Many didn't mention the overcrowding. They didn't talk about shortages. They didn't describe the fear. Instead, they spoke about a moment that came afterward. The moment when the camp finally had enough food again. For the first time in weeks, everyone could eat fully. No reductions. No priority lists. No adjustments. But something unexpected happened. Many prisoners still didn't take their full portion. They ate half, then waited. Because during the crisis, full portions had meant someone else might not get enough. And even when the shortage ended, that habit didn't disappear. One man later said, "It took weeks before I believed the supply wouldn't run out again." There was another change, harder to see. During the emergency, certain prisoners had quietly decided who needed help most. They had evaluated strength, illness, chances of recovery, decisions no one wanted to make, decisions based on survival probability. After the crisis ended, those men avoided responsibility. When problems appeared, they stepped back. When others asked for guidance, they refused. Not because they didn't know what to do, because they remembered what it had felt like to choose. One former medic later explained, "You don't forget the faces you gave less to." Official history recorded the camp as overcrowded but orderly. No riot, no mass collapse, no major loss of control. From the outside, it looked like a system that had worked. But the real stability had come from something quieter. From prisoners who redistributed resources without permission, who created medical spaces that never existed on paper, who reduced their own chances to increase someone else, and sometimes from decisions about who could wait and who could not. That was the part no report described. Because it wasn't policy, it was judgment. And judgment leaves a heavier memory than orders. One detail stayed with many survivors long after the war. Whenever they entered a crowded room, a train station, a shelter, a waiting area, they automatically looked for the weakest person present. Without thinking, without speaking, they counted, estimated, adjusted. The habit never fully disappeared. Because during those weeks in the camp, survival had depended on seeing vulnerability before it became collapse. The records say the camp never failed. That order was maintained. That conditions remained stable despite sudden overcrowding. All of that is true. But stability didn't come from control alone. It came from hundreds of quiet decisions made every day. Small choices, unequal choices, necessary choices. And many of those choices carried a weight long after the crisis ended. In the end, the camp did not collapse. Not because there was enough, but because people were willing to change what fair meant when survival was at risk. That is the part history rarely explains. Because it's uncomfortable. Because it raises a difficult question. When resources disappear, when everyone cannot be helped equally, what matters more? Fairness or survival? And inside that overcrowded camp, the answer was never written down. It was simply lived. In silence,